Stephen Biko, an anti-apartheid activist and father of the Black consciousness movement, once said, "Black man, you are on your own. You are either alive and proud or you are dead." Little did we know that Biko would be murdered by the police in Cape Town, South Africa for these words, a turning point in the struggle of Black South Africans against apartheid. The discovery of diamonds and gold by the British and Dutch settlers led to over 100 years of oppressive white-dominated rule of Black South Africans, ultimately culminating in the institution of apartheid. Beginning in 1948, apartheid dominated South African society until the early 1990s. Apartheid is a system of institutionalized racism and racial social engineering inaugurated by the National Afrikaner Party after its election victory in 1948 to control the Black menace. Under this system of apartheid, life for white South Africans was idyllic. They had a lot of wealth, political participation, freedom to go and do whatever they wanted through legal segregation.
I almost never saw Black people, and that is how successful apartheid was. The goal of apartheid was to keep people separate.
Because of the earlier nonviolent anti-apartheid movement of Mohandas K. Gandhi in South Africa, Indians enjoyed more civil rights than coloreds and blacks, despite racial segregation.
And so the neighborhood was all Indians. The school I went to were all Indians. The shopping centers we shopped at were all Indians.
Blacks, on the other hand, had no political participation, their black citizenships were revoked, and of course they were segregated in all facets of life.
They found all sorts of ways, not just to keep us apart and to divide us, but to put us against each other, so that they gave the coloreds a little bit more privileges than they did the Africans. They gave the Indians a few more privileges than they did the coloreds. So the idea of apartheid was I should look at the Indians and be angry at them, and the Africans should be looking at us and be angry at us, instead of us understanding this is not us, this is the white regime, the apartheid regime.
Between 1948 and 1973, nonviolence inspired by Mahatma Gandhi was the main method of opposition to apartheid by the African National Congress, led by Walter Sisulu, Oliver Tambo, and Nelson Mandela. These three men organized many peaceful protests, but in the Sharpsville labor protest of 1960, 69 protesters were killed by the South African police. The police brutally cracked down on the resistance movement and arrested these three young leaders of the ANC and imprisoned them on Robben Island. Nonviolent resistance was not working. There was a power vacuum in black leadership, and into this void entered Stephen Biko, a young medical student who organized black South African students and formed the South African Student Organization.
See, Biko had to slip out of his house and we met at somebody else's place. And so I met him. I was deeply impressed by him. He was a very bright, very intelligent young man, very courageous.
Biko was inspired by American civil rights leaders like Malcolm X and Stokely Carmichael, who believed in self-empowerment through education and organization. Biko, unlike previous leaders, changed the anti-apartheid struggle from a political one run by a few people to an intensely personal one for all black South Africans through empowerment, organization, and education.
I think one of the most important impacts that Steve Biko had, he started the movement for black consciousness. You know, what Mandela was doing was really on the political realm.
The philosophy of black consciousness emphasized black self-esteem, self-assertion, and psychological emancipation from years of being made to feel inferior to whites. Steve Biko wrote, "Being black is not a matter of pigmentation. Being black is a reflection of a mental attitude. Merely describing yourself as black, you have started on a road towards emancipation. You've committed yourself to fight against all forces that seek to use your blackness as a stamp that marks you out as a subservient being."
So black consciousness was a movement that said to people, black is beautiful, black is dignity. You can be proud of being black. The first real movement of political organization and political mobilization for people saying, why should we remain underground, and why should we be satisfied with the way in which the government is treating us, and why should Sharpeville be the end of our struggle? It will not be the end of our struggle. The first thing that actually made that clear was the black consciousness movement.
The South African government initially allowed Biko freedom to carry on his organization because they thought he was maintaining separation of races. Biko mobilized and unified many anti-apartheid groups for labor strikes, organized social empowerment programs, and published an underground newspaper that educated young South Africans about black consciousness. For these activities, he was placed in a ban, which prevented him from meeting with more than one person at a time, required reporting his whereabouts to the police at all times, and restricted his travel. It is at this time when Biko caught the attention of Donald Woods, an editor of the Daily Dispatch of Johannesburg, a liberal newspaper. Woods met Biko under the advice of Mamphele Rempele, a close friend of Biko's. Wood wrote many positive articles about Biko, exposing his great qualities of leadership and black consciousness to the whole world.
We believe that in our country there shall be no minority, there shall be no majority, there shall just be people. And those people will have the same status before the law, and they will have the same political rights before the law.
On June 16, 1976, in the Soweto Township, 15,000 school children, inspired by Biko's writing, were protesting against apartheid because Bantu education of mathematics and social studies were to be taught in Afrikaans. The students wanted to learn English, the language of business and jobs. The police killed about 2,389 school children. The government blamed the uprising on Biko. The world was outraged at the brutality of apartheid, and Biko became a more respected leader. But Biko and other young black South African students also became targets of the South African police and government that considered them as dangerous militants. Many were banned and arrested, and some mysteriously died in custody. On August 18, 1977, Biko was traveling to a meeting in Cape Town illegally while under a ban. He was arrested in Grahamstown by the South African police and brutally beaten and murdered.
Oh, first the story was that he had starved himself to death. It was on a hunger strike. Then they changed their story. They had kept him in Pretoria, that they had starved him and they had beaten him up systematically, and when they found out one day that they had gone too far and that he was going to die, they wrapped him in a blanket, naked, without any clothes, threw him in the back of a police van and drove him 800, 900 miles from Pretoria to Port Elizabeth, where they put him in a cell where he finally died. The choice which the students made at that time was they had killed Steve Biko, and we will not let him die in vain. That had a tremendous impact. It was an iconic turning point.
Steve Biko was murdered because his ability to empower, educate, and organize black South Africans made him an absolute threat to white apartheid rule. Biko's murder outraged the world, exposed the brutality of apartheid, and alienated South Africa from the rest of the world. Among black South Africans, however, Biko's death inspired many different organizations to join forces to end apartheid in 1990 and freely elect the first black South African president, Nelson Mandela, in 1994.
So Biko had a tremendous influence on the course of the struggle and bringing a new generation to understand their responsibility in continuing the struggle for justice. Steve Biko helped us to understand a lot about ourselves and about our struggle. So for us in South Africa, he is an unmatched hero.